and Joe is working with Integra Consulting, and Joe is based in Northern Virginia and Washington, D.C. Has a lot of experience in scenario planning, and is going to be the primary facilitator for our scenario planning workshop in the spring. We also have Liz Mack, who is with Enviro Issues, who helps us out on the logistical side of things. And then we have some folks from the Northwest Basin Range Synthesis Steering Committee, as well as some kind of folks that are sitting in for other folks on the steering committee, and then also some folks from our kind of core backbone team for the project. I've spoken with several of our other steering committee members who are planning on watching the replay of this scenario planning webinar so that they can get up to speed and also weigh in on a couple of things that we'll be asking from you all as we move through the scenario planning workshop planning process. So the day's objectives for today's webinar are we're going to get a better understanding what scenario planning is and the potential payoffs for the Northwest Basin Range Synthesis Project. And we also want to be able to choose a focal point for the scenarios. And we'll be explaining more about the focal point as well as have the steering committee members vote on the focal point after the webinar is complete. So just a quick refresher, some of you are probably already are aware of this, and some of you are new to this, but we are going to use the software GoToMeeting, and so there's an arrow up in the right-hand corner of your screen that's orange, and that's how, if you click on that, you can access the control panel. And Joe, if you could click to the next slide. So and go ahead and click one more time, Joe. So yeah, once you click that arrow, this is a similar slide to the last one. You'll have this control panel pop up, and if you can click again, Joe, you can ask questions down in the bottom right corner, and Joe and myself and Liz will keep an eye out for those. We'll just keep the phone line open, and so if you just have questions that you just want to ask directly, you can do that as well. And go ahead and click, Joe. And that'll just, this red arrow that's coming up is just showing you how to send the question. So the next slide is shows you how to raise your hand. There may be an exercise within the webinar where we ask folks to raise their hand, but we also may not end up using that feature just because we have a small group of us today on the webinar, and it may not be a necessary feature to use. Next slide. So why are we having this webinar? So the Great Basin LCC and Todd Hopkins, who was the former science coordinator, was able to bring in some funding and send out a contract to hold a scenario planning exercise for this Northwest Basin Range Synthesis Project. The workshop will be sometime later in the spring of 2017. So your role kind of as the Northwest Basin Range Steering Committee will be explained better today in today's webinar. And also, just our expectations of you as we move forward. I've asked folks from the steering committee to also consider inviting people within their organizations to attend the eventual scenario planning workshop and to give some input on this webinar, so that is why some other folks are here today as well. And so that's about it for my part, and so I'm going to pass it off to Joe Wilmore with Integra Consulting, and you can take it away, Joe.
Okay, thanks very much, Levi. Let me tell you just a little bit about who I am. I've worked as a consultant for 35 years, internationally and domestically, with a wide range of federal, state, and private and nonprofit organizations. As Levi said, I'm with Integra LLC, and scenario planning, the first experience I had with scenario planning was in the early 1980s when I was involved in facilitating some scenarios for Royal Dutch Shell, which is the organization that's credited with developing this concept. And it's now a pretty widespread, widely used tool. And we'll talk about that in more detail as we go through it. But enough about history. Let me tell you a story, okay? Let's start out in the early 1970s, okay? The head of corporate planning for Royal Dutch Shell was a Frenchman by the name of Pierre Back, and he was very frustrated because he felt that the company, Royal Dutch Shell, was pursuing a strategy that was based on a couple of critical assumptions. And if those assumptions turned out to be wrong, the company would be ruined. And the primary assumptions were that oil would always remain plentiful, and because it would be plentiful, it would be cheap. And so basically what that meant was that Pierre Back wanted to challenge the thinking that the company was making so they could test their strategy to see if what they were planning on and what they assumed the future to be, if those were the correct assumptions or if they needed a more robust strategy, one that would hedge a little bit and protect themselves against the future. You see, because they'd assumed that oil was going to be plentiful and therefore would be cheap, what that meant was Royal Dutch Shell had invested basically all their capital in acquiring new tankers and building refinery capacity. And Pierre Back wanted to challenge those assumptions to say what would happen if those assumptions were wrong and how likely are those assumptions to be true. So he crafted a story, which later came to be called scenario or scenario planning. And this story involved the incredibly implausible event of a terrorist event in the Middle East that severs a pipeline in Saudi Arabia. And he presented it to senior management saying, what would happen if this happened? And they crunched the numbers and they concluded we'd be bankrupt as a company within a year because they would have so much money tied up in tankers and refinery capacity, and they wouldn't be prepared for what would happen if oil suddenly became scarce, even just a temporary blip of 4, 5, 6 months, and so the price went up because they had a company that was operating on a strategy that said oil's going to be cheap and it's going to be plentiful. So Back said, well, we may assume that to be true, but how do we know that assumption's accurate? So Royal Dutch Shell put out its feelers, and they started doing some research. They found out something they couldn't quite figure out why this was so, but back in the early 1970s, the Egyptian army, of all things, was acquiring high-powered fire hoses, excessive numbers of them. And they couldn't figure out any sort of rationale why the Egyptian army would suddenly be doing this. And as they looked a little bit further, they found out that the Syrian army was doing a lot more war games, anticipating an assault on the Golan Heights. And they thought, gee, this looks like these guys are preparing for war. And as they put out more feelers, they discovered that OPEC, which was headed by the Shah of Iran, theoretically an ally of the West, and up to that point had always been a very weak organization, rubber stamped pretty much whatever the Western powers wanted, was organizing very quietly. And so Royal Dutch Shell put all that stuff together, and they thought, you know what? We think Egypt and Syria are preparing for war. And we think OPEC is preparing to support them. And so Royal Dutch Shell quietly started canceling their contracts for new refineries, selling off tankers that they'd acquired, and they started buying up old discarded oil wells, because the deal with an oil well, at least on land, is when the price of oil is cheap, it's not affordable to harvest about the last 20% of oil that's in that well. But when the price of oil goes up, since you're primarily just floating water into the well and letting the oil, you're driving the oil to the surface, it becomes economical to harvest that oil. And in 1973, what happened was the Yom Kippur War. Egypt and Syria invaded Israel. A major conflict started to the point of Russia got involved, and the U.S., of course. One of the things that happened is that when people looked at the results of the war, you're seeing a picture of the Suez Canal, and the Egyptian army used the high-powered fire hoses to blow through the anti-tank walls lining the Suez Canal. so their armor could get through into the Sinai. And OPEC, in support of Israel and the Palestinians, announced an embargo of gasoline to the West. And, of course, here in the U.S., we had odd, even gas rationing. What's interesting is most of the world was unprepared for that. The Royal Dutch Shell, in 2 years, went from the 11th biggest oil company in the world to the second biggest. They were probably the only major corporation on the planet that was prepared for that war. It's not that they predicted it, but they started out with a strategic plan that assumed the complete opposite of how the world was going to play out. But they challenged their thinking. They became aware of what their blind spots were, and they were able to question their assumptions and identify an emerging reality that was a threat to what they thought was going to play out and a threat to their plan. And they were able to hedge for that. They were able to prepare. So let's talk a little bit about what scenario planning is about. First of all, I want to ask a question. Have any of you, the participants in here, had a chance to do scenario planning or participate in a scenario planning activity before with the organization you're in or a previous organization? Has anyone done scenario work previously? Okay, so this should all be...
Yeah, this is Jeremy. I've done a resource vulnerability assessment that had some similar parallels.
Got it. Okay, good. So let's talk about what scenario planning is about, what it does. One thing that it does is it allows you to see things that others don't see. Not that you have magical eyesight, but the process that you use to create the scenarios means that you challenge the assumptions that you're making, you challenge your vision of the future, and you test it. And you see if there are some things that maybe when you made your strategy 5 years ago made sense, but in the meantime, things have evolved or changed in some ways that you haven't noticed. And so there may be some things that you need to rethink. Another thing is there's this concept called a blind spot or a perceptual failure. And there are things that we don't know. For instance, I don't know a lot about tax policy. So I know when it comes tax time for my business, I need to hire an accountant. That's not a blind spot for me. That's just an area of ignorance. And I'm aware it's an area of ignorance. So I either hire help, people who do know what they're doing, or I avoid making a lot of big decisions in those areas or I act cautiously because I know I'm not informed around that. A blind spot, however, is an area where we don't know that we don't know. So in other words, we're not only ignorant about that, but we don't know that we're ignorant about it. Maybe we used to know, but the world has changed. The analogy I sometimes use is imagine you're driving on a road at night and it's very dark out. There are no street lights, no lights lighting the road other than the headlights of your car. And you're convinced you've been on this road before. You're convinced that this is a long stretch of road that runs about 20, 30 miles straight. And in reality, there's been some work done on the road and there are a series of hairpin curves coming up. And it's not that those hairpin curves are impossible to negotiate. You can safely negotiate them if you're driving cautiously or if you know to anticipate them. But if you don't know they're there and you think that the road is straight, you're likely going to have an accident. So that's a blind spot for you. Another thing that scenario planning does is it improves your strategic vision. This is not about predicting the future, and it's not about attempting to see all possible futures, but rather it's helping you to understand what's relevant, what's going on right now that's relevant to the issues that matter to you. And what is it that you know and what is it you don't know? To put it another way, you may still be ignorant about a lot of stuff, but you're going to reduce the number of blind spots that you have. Another thing that's very good about scenario planning is it helps you manage uncertainty. It doesn't eliminate the uncertainty, but it helps you get a better understanding of it so you see why things happen the way they happen. And you may not be able to be proactive about everything, but you can react quicker. You can anticipate stuff that is going to happen. Another thing that's important is systems thinking. It helps you understand why things occur. There's a great line that one of the Royal Dutch Shell scenario planners, a Dutchman by the name of Kees van der Heijden, used to say. He would say that typically for primitive cultures, if it rains in the foothills, if the river overflows, then they just assume the gods are angry and they sacrifice a virgin and hope it doesn't happen the next time around. But people who understand how systems work, if they see that it rains in the foothills, they expect the river to overflow in 2 days. So when it rains in the mountains, they head for high ground because they know a flood is coming in 48 hours. That's what systems thinking is about. Systems thinking is about understanding how steps A, B, and C are going to result in F, G, H, I, J, and K. And so you understand how these things connect and how they link. And another thing that scenario planning is very capable of doing is it helps people's perceptions to evolve, and it helps to change those perceptions. Scenario planning is actually an activity that has been used very extensively by the National Park Service and a range of other federal organizations. For instance, I did some scenario planning work with the Office of Research and Development within the EPA to help them look at their strategic environment and how they need to position themselves for the future. The last bullet that's down here says finding shared strategic language. And the example we're going to talk about next involving South Africa and the transition from apartheid to democratic rule, majority-based rule, is a good example of this. But typically what happens is scenarios will have names, and they'll develop a shorthand that allow people and stakeholders to refer to strategic concepts by using that language. So it creates a common way for people to talk about important future issues, and it allows for a common conversation. So it's especially valuable for organizations or situations like the GBLCC, where you've got players from multiple organizations, including ranchers or local governments, people who aren't from this, they aren't all on the same email list. They don't all have the same strategic plan. So does anyone have any questions initially about what scenario planning is before we go into more examples and how we're going to use them? Let's see. I see a note. Aaron, you've got a question? Is your phone muted?
Question. No, I'm good, Joe.
Okay, good. Good. Okay, great. So I started out by talking about the Yom Kippur War and the OPEC oil embargo in 73. Let's talk about 1991 and 1992. Originally, what was going on? Well, a lot of things were going on, but South Africa was an apartheid state. So it was pretty common to see signs like what you see in the bottom right hand of your screen, where whites had rights and had access and had political dominance compared to the rest of the country, either black or other races like Indians, for instance. And eventually, because of all the political pressure plus the demographic pressure, South Africa was faced with the reality of they were going to have to transition from apartheid. Most people, however, assumed that this transition was going to be bloody. The only question was how bloody would it be? Would the Boers, the South African whites, seek to hold on to as many resources and as much power as possible? Would a lot of the native blacks, the Zulu, for instance, and some of the other groups, some of the other tribes, seek payoff and revenge? Would you have widespread looting, theft, government seizure of private land? There was, quite frankly, a basic assumption that the transition would be bloody, and a successful transition would just limit the bloodshed. They'd be talking about tens of thousands of people dying, not hundreds of thousands or millions. So Nelson Mandela, who at that particular point was head of the ANC, and Pierre van der Klerk, who was head of the outgoing South African apartheid-based government, white government, put forces together, and they created a team that was going to develop scenarios for South Africa's transition. And what's interesting, these scenarios ended up being talked about throughout the country. They were covered in newspapers. They were played on radio, and they became a way for people to talk about the transition. And I want to talk about these real briefly, just to give you an example. They're sort of colorful pictures. So in the upper left, you have what was referred to as the ostrich scenario. And the ostrich scenario was one that was sort of dictated by superpowers. It was forced upon South Africa, but the whites would put their head in the sand and ignore reality and resist as much as possible. And so this would be a long, drawn-out, painful scenario with international pressure and a lot of denial of reality. Then the upper right quadrant, you have the wounded duck. And the wounded duck would be one where you would have a tremendous amount of violence back and forth as everyone tried to look out for their own personal best interests. Whites not wanting to give up authority, not wanting to give up positions within cabinets. Blacks wanting as much responsibility and authority as they could get. The lower left was called Icarus, because what happened here is you had white flight, you had blacks taking control of everything, with a high percentage of blacks being relatively poor. What would happen is the government would seek to redress that, provide an annual stipend based on diamond and gold and resource money to every person in the country to make up for the decades or even century of deprivation and poverty. But the problem was that this would not be sustainable. Initially, there'd be a lot of glory, but ultimately they'd crash and burn. The lower right was called Flight of the Flamingos. And the argument here was that flamingos by themselves become bait for predators. But if they stay together, they're safe. They're slow, they're ungainly, they're awkward. But when they fly as a flock, it works. When they stay together, they're safe, and they flourish. And the idea with Flight of the Flamingos was if South Africa stays together as a country, it doesn't break up into separate white and black homelands. If they minimize the violence, if they pledge to work together, to recognize they have to put differences apart from each other, and if they don't make an effort to try and address all grievances right away, or recognize that poor people were probably going to stay poor for the first 10 years or so after the blacks took power, that it wasn't possible to use the country's resources to fix all social problems and correct all infrastructure issues right away and provide everyone a good house, that ultimately the country would be successful. And so the path they chose was the Flight of the Flamingos. And that's one that if you research South African literature, you'll see references to Flight of the Flamingos, where people talk about the flamingo strategy, where that was actually used to create a nationwide dialogue and a language to change perceptions for how people did stuff. So let's talk a little bit about how scenario planning shapes perceptions. Let's see, here we go. Just need to define the arrow to advance this. Typically, for most folks, a lot of what's going on in the world consists of unperceived events followed by surprises. So in other words, things going on that we don't really notice. We're too busy doing our day job or dealing with the other stuff in our life. And then something pops up that surprises us and we think, gee, where did that happen? How did that come about? To folks who are a little more perceptive, what they see are random events. Things that happen and they go, oh, why did that wildfire happen here? Oh, yeah, why did why did we end up with an explosion of invasive plants in this particular area? It just appears to be random. You notice what's going on, but you don't see connections to things. You dig deeper and you start to see your patterns. You may not understand why it's happening, but you do see connections or you see something that's repetitive. Ultimately, if you do a real deep dive, what happens, you understand the system. And you understand these things that to most folks they didn't perceive or were surprises or they were random. You start to understand how they actually make sense. And so one of the things that scenario planning does is it helps us understand why some things that appear to be random may actually be part of a larger system. And by understanding that system, we can get advance warning before things happen. Let's talk about 1983 now. Another example. In 1983, Royal Dutch Shell was faced with a situation where they were looking to invest in a natural gas platform in the North Sea. This was a $5 billion decision. That's B, billion with a B. And at the time, they crunched the numbers and it made sense. The person who was head of corporate planning for Royal Dutch Shell at that particular point, a guy by the name of Peter Schwartz, said, well, what big assumption are we making with this strategy? And the assumption that Royal Dutch Shell was making was that natural gas would be expensive. And the reason it would be expensive was the world's largest exporter of natural gas was the Soviet Union. And because Western Europe did not want to subsidize their own invasion, since the Soviets were viewed as a hostile state, they had a 30% tariff on all natural gas coming from Russia. So it hiked the price up artificially. So in this particular case, Peter Schwartz asked the question, what would happen if that 30% tariff disappeared? And the result was that the $5 billion natural gas platform in the North Sea would become a sinkhole. It wouldn't be profitable anymore. You'd build the platform, but it wouldn't make sense to harvest any natural gas from the North Sea. So he and his team then asked the question, is there a plausible story that would explain how that 30% tariff on natural gas from the Soviet Union would disappear? And they came up with a scenario that they entitled the greening of Russia. And in their scenario, they identified a number of real players, none of whom were in senior leadership positions. One of them was a junior leader by the name of Gorbachev. Another was a senior economist who had begun writing papers talking about how, gee, perhaps it's time for the Soviet Union to start looking at a private sector economy, allow people to have their own agricultural plots, grow their own plants, sell things and make their own money. And in the early 1980s, specifically in 1983, all of a sudden things started happening. Church bells started ringing in East Germany, indicating that the religious organizations were opposing communism. The Berlin Wall was spontaneously torn down. There was truly no government in the world that was prepared for the fall of communism. A host of organizations, including various elements of the U.S. government, were holding seminars or workshops or studying to figure out, how did this happen so quickly? Why were we so unprepared for it? Royal Dutch Shell did the same thing, except they asked a different question. In looking at the greening of Russia scenario, which came out for them in 1980, they had said, okay, we don't think Russia is going to become friendly, but if they do, what would the system look like? How would we get from a Soviet Union that has nuclear missiles targeted at the West to a Soviet Union where they're not perceived as a threat to the West anymore? And he identified 28 steps. So Royal Dutch Shell's conference was to look at, why did it take so long? Because they thought once the process started that the Soviet Union would fall quicker than it did. And so they wanted to learn from the process because they thought that they had anticipated a quicker fall than what actually happened. And they were probably the only large organization in the world that anticipated this. So usually when people look, or organizations look at the future, what happens is they tend to view it from three perspectives. They either say, okay, let's take today, in other words, the last bullet, business as usual, and just assume that today continues on into the future. And that almost never happens. Even if we don't go through major stochastic changes, the reality is things never stay the way they always are. They always change to some extent. And then they look at a rosy future. We take today, but we make things better. Then they look at a gloomy future. Today, but we make things worse. And the reality is that that's not how the world plays out. Instead, when we talk about the real world, first of all, it's never completely predictable. So scenario planning is not about predicting for the future. So part of that scenario planning in order to test the strategy is to say, how well does our strategy and our organizational setup and our resources work when we get hit by surprises? The future always has some curveballs we don't expect. Second, if you're prepared for it, there's always some good and some bad elements to every scenario. The key is you need to have some degree of preparation. And the last point is that regardless of what happens, the real rewards are for the people who've got the best insight and the quickest reaction. Even if you can't be proactive, if you can react quicker and more knowledgeably than anyone else, you have a better chance to benefit from how that world plays out. And that's especially true when we talk about the world of natural resources and climate and the environment. So let's talk a little bit about how a scenario planning process works, and we'll talk about the steering committee and the backbone team and how you fit into this. First of all, we have to start by identifying the scenario focus and scope. Earlier you heard Levi talk about identify a focal point. Basically, that's the focus of the scenarios. And we have a couple of particular focal points that we've identified for you. And we're going to ask you to give us direction. as to where the scenario should focus, because a scenario planning process can be incredibly valuable, but you need to start by identifying what are we going to focus on, okay? So you start by identifying your scenario focus and the scope. Then, once you've done that, you identify trends, drivers, and key uncertainties. I'm going to give you an example of how this works in the next slide. But basically, let's suppose we were to look at wildfires in the Great Basin area. What that would mean is that we would say, so what trends do we see around wildfires? What are the key drivers? What seems to have the biggest impact on whether it's a bad year for wildfires or not? What are the key unknowns? Amount of rainfall, reservoir capacity, What's going on out there that has an impact on this, but we don't know how that's going to play out, okay? Then from those trends, drivers, and key uncertainties, you identify key themes. Basically, you synthesize. You might identify 50 or 100 different trends, drivers, and key uncertainties. If you say, let's come up with 2 or 3 or 4 key themes, what can we synthesize from this? And from that, you're going to create a scenario matrix, and that will suggest stories, and you then refine those scenarios. And that's another place where we're going to be using the steering committee and the backbone team, is that once we've created a scenario matrix, Levi and I and some other subject matter experts will develop initial drafts, but we're going to ask for the steering committee and the backbone team to give us direction when you read through the scenarios. What sounds useful? What sounds like a waste of time? What provides useful insight? What's too close to the status quo, or what's too unbelievable? And that's not going to involve a lot of heavy lifting on your part, but it is going to involve a little bit of review and a little bit of thinking and some feedback to us, so we can create scenarios to really challenge people's thinking and give folks system insight. Then once we've refined the scenarios, we have a discussion. We pull people together, and that's what the workshop in the second quarter of 2017 is about. That'll be an opportunity for people to review the scenarios and talk about them, and talk about a range of different questions. And we'll show you some of the types of questions people would look at. And they identify insights and have strategic conversations. And then from those insights, it turns into, okay, so if this were to play out, what would it mean for our agency? Or if this were to be the world that the future held 2 years from now, what would we need to do to prepare for it? How would our strategy need to change? What are we unprepared for? Does anyone have any questions about this scenario planning process and how it works? Okay, let's proceed. So let's look at a mock scenario matrix. Okay. So first of all, let's choose the topic of wildfires. And let's suppose that we've gone through the second and third stages, and what we've done is we've done research on this. We've identified key drivers. What are the things that have the biggest, most likely causes or determiners of if 2017 is going to be a bad year for wildfires in this area, or if it'll be relatively, let's say, friendlier in terms of wildfires, not as bad or not as severe. What trends do we see? What are the uncertainties? And let's suppose that one of the trends or one of the issues that we see that's really critical on this is the role that government plays, how involved and how proactive government is in planning, in providing resources, in coordinating efforts, and doing research, okay? And so we look at this issue of government involvement, and let's suppose we choose one axis on our x-axis that says increase federal leadership and support. So in other words, the federal government gets more involved, spends more money, provides more direction when it comes to wildfires. So what might be a different perspective on that? Well, let's suppose that the federal government is instead of acting for one reason or another. Either the new administration doesn't have an interest in this, gridlock on Capitol Hill, budget shortage, maybe a war in the Middle East sucks up all the oxygen in the room, whatever. But in any case, the federal government doesn't provide a lot of leadership and a lot of direction and a lot of resources, in which case states need to take the leadership role dealing with wildfires. Okay? So we have two different takes on wildfires in terms of this particular issue. Then let's choose a second one, and maybe a key factor in determining wildfires is what's happening weather-wise. So maybe let's assume we have an extended drought in 2017, less rainfall than we had previously, okay, which wasn't good because that was low too. So an extended drought. And you can see already if we have a scenario in this upper left quadrant where states are having to play the leadership role, but there's an extended drought, that has implications because since there's an extended drought, states already have agricultural issues. There are farmers and ranchers who are looking for support. There are state economic factors that because of the extended drought are being affected. Now, instead of an extended drought, the other approach may be maybe the average rainfall is the same, but it's more extreme. We have extreme weather variation. We have long dry spells followed by heavy rain, a deluge. So lots of topsoil gets lost. Water doesn't get a chance to soak in. It runs off, heads off into rivers, runs downstream. Okay? And so what we can do for each of these quadrants is these give us different perspectives, different scenarios. So the upper right, extended drought, but federal leadership and support. Okay, so that would give you one perspective on things versus the lower right, extreme weather variation, dry then deluge, okay, where the federal government plays a role. Or the lower left, where states are having to take the leadership role, and you've got this extreme weather. Or instead of a drought, with this extreme weather, you may have situations where there's tremendous dislocation. You have topsoil being lost. You have farmers and ranchers being affected. Crop yields are down. And so that affects where states are spending their money and what their priorities are. So that's the process that's used to create scenarios. To put it another way, this is not just a case of a couple people head down to the bar, have a couple beers, and grab a cocktail napkin and start jotting down thoughts. Instead, there's actually a relatively systematic process that allows you to test and create stories around the focal point that you've chosen based on the critical issues or themes that have emerged. So, how do we end up with good scenarios? Well, there are a couple of different things. One thing is you're looking for stories that have this nice mix of plausibility but also stretch. In other words, you want a story where people read through the scenario and they go, yeah, this is happening now, or this is happening in some parts of the basin. Yeah, I can see this happening. And then some stretch where people go, whoa, I don't know. Didn't really think that would happen. You don't want things too incredulous. You don't want Martians landing from Mars or, the world being obliterated or something like that. But the point is, every scenario should have some elements of what we call plausibility that everyone just accepts. This is common knowledge, kind of the conventional wisdom, and then some things that challenge the conventional wisdom. There should be no scenario that's truly good or truly bad. There should be unbalancing elements. Think of it as a roller coaster. Good points that people look at and go, yeah, we're prepared for this. And then bad points where people go, yikes, this is not what we thought would happen. This is not good for us. We're not ready for this. There needs to be enough detail that it feels right, that it's accurate. And it needs to be internally consistent. And we can talk about that later once we actually start to develop scenarios and explain why it reads the way it does. But basically what that means is internally consistent is you wouldn't have a scenario if we go back to the previous slide about wildfires, two slides ago, we wouldn't have a scenario that basically talks about how, let's say, the federal government plays a leadership role, but then the federal government abdicates all leadership. Okay, that wouldn't be internally consistent. The changing plot, basically what that means is you alter the perspectives. So the scenarios don't have the same perspective in each scenario. You might have one scenario that's told from the perspective of someone in state government. You might have another one that's told from the perspective of a rancher. Another one that's told from a field office for someone, let's say, Bureau of Land Management or Fish and Wildlife or some other federal bureau. But the idea is different perspectives that will provide different insight. So someone might go, I never saw it that way. I mean, I thought about this policy, but I didn't think how someone from that position would see it. And then you provide rich detail. You provide enough detail to help this feel plausible and to help people see some of the possible implications. So that's what good scenarios look like. Now, so we've crafted a scenario. And more specifically, we'll have 4 scenarios, but one at a time. At the workshop, people will read through the scenarios, and then we'll facilitate discussions. So one thing we try and identify are what are the blind spots? In other words, what was it we were unprepared for? What was surprising in the scenario? What was it that people didn't think would happen? Or they may even feel so strongly as to go, no, that can't happen. I don't believe that. Even if you don't think it'll happen, it's probably revealing of a blind spot. You have a mental model that says, this isn't possible. It can't happen. It also tells us a lot about our beliefs, about our key assumptions, about what we believe to be true in the world. Just because we have an assumption doesn't mean it's wrong, but it's critical to be aware of what assumptions we are that we're making. Because you can't be sure your assumptions are accurate unless you can test them, and you can't test them unless you know you're making them. It helps identify data gaps. What is it we need to find out? And once you've done all that, it helps you determine, so how do we adjust? Or do we need to adjust? And with any scenario, you could say, what would be a good response? If this were the world we were faced with, what would be a good way to deal with it? And last of all, even if you think it's not likely that it's going to happen, what would the warning signs be? Think back to the greening of Russia scenario I told you about with World Dutch Shell in the early 80s. That's a situation where they didn't expect the Soviet Union to become friendly to the West. But they recognized if that did happen, it would devastate the company. So they said, what are the early warning signs? So if this does start to happen, we can adjust. And that's exactly what World Dutch Shell did. So the workshop, we'll have the scenarios developed by then. And what happens then is that's a case of people reading through the scenarios or having the scenarios presented to them, and then having a facilitated discussion about the scenarios, and then a facilitated discussion about, so what does that mean for us? What would our strategies look like? What would we do differently? Collectively, okay, how does this affect this project? So I talked about focal points. In other words, the focal point is just a fancy scenario planning term for saying, what do we want the scenario to focus on? Now, the first thing I want to mention is you might look at these and say that all of these are relevant and important. And I'm going to have Levi talk about each of these in just a minute, and we're going to talk about how we're going to use these. But the point is, let's suppose that someone chose water use and availability. Some of these issues, as well as some others, will show up in the scenario as you add detail. So, for instance, one of the things we looked at was sage grouse. Okay, it's not down here as a focal point, but we'll probably have a scenario or two where the sage grouse appears as an issue or as a factor in one way or another. But it's critical, rather than say, let's talk about everything, let's talk about the future. That's not very helpful, because what we need to do is we need to say, on this particular focus or focal point, what are the key trends? What are the key unknowns? What are the drivers that shape what's happening in this area? So if we were to choose, let's say, climate, we'd look at what are the key things that are shaping climate in the Great Basin area, okay? So the other point that I'm going to make, and Levi will tell you more detail about this, is after we've finished this webinar, an email is going to go out to all of you, and, as well as other folks that we want input and direction from, and we're going to ask you to prioritize these focal points. So what that means, as opposed to simply picking one, we're going to ask you to rank them based upon what you feel would provide the most insight or the most value to look at from a future perspective, to say, what does the future hold for this, or hold for us in this area, okay? So Levi, do you want to talk a little bit about the focal points?
Yeah, I'll just say a couple words briefly. Can you hear me? There, Joe?
I can hear you.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Yeah, so these focal points come out of kind of the key issues that our steering committee outlined in our May 27th meeting, which was our primary in-person meeting for the Northwest Basin Marine Synthesis Project thus far. There was a couple other key issues, and I kind of narrowed it down to these. But like Joe said, we'll be sending out an opportunity for steering committee members to rank these different focal points for the upcoming workshop. And to definitely reiterate what Joe said as well, is to just keep in mind that these components of these different themes will still come up in the scenarios we create. So yeah, give some thought to both for kind of the Northwest Basin Range Synthesis Project as kind of as a landscape conservation effort, as well as within your individual organizations, what type of scenario focal point might be best for your conservation planning efforts and things of that nature. Also, I'll probably leave a blank in the voting process if you wanted to add something that's not on this list that you think should be actually the priority of the focal point, or the actual focal point, and we can then discuss that more as a steering committee if I'm missing something major here in this list. So, yeah, just expect to see that email shortly after the webinar, probably in the next couple days, if not the beginning of next week.
Okay.
Yeah, that's it for me, Joe. Pass back to you.
Sure. Does anyone have any questions about any of these topics? Would you like Levi to expand a little bit more on any of these? If so, this is a good time to ask out, because like Levi said, in a couple of days, that email is going to go out. We're going to ask you to prioritize these. Okay, I don't see any response. So let's talk a little bit about next steps. So what happens? I know that we originally said that this webinar was going to be 90 minutes, but when Levi and I talked about it, we said we wanted to try and keep it to that 60 or 70 minutes in case people had questions. Plus, frankly, being stuck online, listening to someone on the phone for 90 minutes is tough. So we're deliberately trying to be efficient here with your time and efficient in terms of how we cover stuff. So we're pretty close to wrapping stuff up. So next steps. As we just said, Levi's going to send out an email to you to ask you to prioritize the focal points. And I just want to check. Levi, I don't know if you've decided how you wanted to do this, but I think we talked about a scheme where if there are, let's say, 5 focal points plus a blank that you could insert something.
Yeah, that's correct.
Would rank them in terms of first choice all the way to your 6th choice, okay? And so effectively what this means is the item that gets the fewest amount of points we're probably going to end up choosing, because that means it got ranked first the most, okay? So we're going to ask you to rank the focal points, and there will be a recording of this available. So if you want to go back and listen to this, or if you want to show it to anyone else, the point that Levi made that I want to emphasize that I think is critical is that ideally what would happen is we develop these scenarios, and then you can use these scenarios back in your organization. Not to go back and say, hey, some group of people got together and said this is what the future is going to look like. No, we're not predicting the future. Rather, we're trying to write stories about a subject that people have agreed this is important for us to focus on for the future, and have called in a range of different experts and resources to make sure that those stories are informed and accurate, but they challenge people's assumptions and thinking, so we gain insight about those. So we do a better job understanding that issue and planning and preparing for the future. So it's really critical to give us some guidance about what scenarios would be very useful for your organization. Okay. Now, I also know that especially for folks in the federal level, this is a challenging time because you're hearing stories about the next administration and who may or may not be nominated to head a particular agency, and you don't know who's, or the particular department, you don't know who they're going to then appoint for a particular agency and what changes they're going to make in terms of policy. And the point that I'd make is scenario planning is incredibly useful for dealing with uncertainty. And this is a very uncertain time right now for a lot of domestic, internal, environmental, resource, climate, land use, and nature policy. So scenario planning is actually a really effective tool to be using at this time. So ranking the focal points and thinking a little bit about what would be useful issues for us to focus on, even just within our bureau or our office. That should help drive how you prioritize this stuff. Second thing is once we have issues set up, once we have a focal point that's been created, Levi and I will be reaching out to some of you either to give us some initial input around trends and drivers and uncertainties, or to identify subject matter experts or resources so that we can compile this, basically a list of, so what's going on in this issue? Let's suppose that we chose water, okay, and water rights. So what's going on in water rights in this area that's relevant for us to know about? Then we're also going to ask for dates on the workshop. Right now, the best we can tell you is second quarter of 2017, okay? And Levi will probably send out either an email or some sort of doodle survey. Then the last thing, and this will be a big piece, is with the subject matter experts and Levi and I working together, we'll create some drafts of scenarios, but then we're going to need people on the steering committee or from the backbone team to give us direction, to look at stuff and go, you know, this is too close to where things are now. There's not enough stretch to this. Or this is too much stretch. This is implausible for most folks who will read this. Or there's not enough detail. So those are really the next steps. They don't all happen right away, but you can expect to probably start to see drafts of scenarios in January. So really over the next 30 to 45 days, we'll start to have scenario versions or drafts that people can react to and give us direction and give us input on. And the focal point piece, that input, should be coming in a matter of days, and once that's resolved, then we'll be reaching out for subject matter experts and resources. Does anyone have any questions or comments about these next steps? Okay. The other thing that I'm going to say is you shouldn't hesitate to reach out to Levi if once we choose a particular focal point and you've got a particular, specific interest in that, or you've got a lot of expertise in that area, to reach out to Levi and say, hey, Levi, I want to be a player on this. I want to be very heavily involved in the scenarios. I've got some people, my bureau has got some people, or my field office has some people that would be the top folks in the field around this issue, okay? So just a couple of wrap-up points, just a few things I want to say. Thanks for your time and your attention. I know you're all busy, and especially given December. You know, so much stuff going on, people having to use leave time, the whole thing. Does anyone have any additional questions or comments? Anything you want some clarity on, or you need to have a little more explanation on?
So this is Linda, and I would appreciate it if you could, you know, some of the examples that you gave earlier of scenario planning, what were the focal points exactly? I mean, I'm trying to leap from your Royal Dutch Shell examples to this kind of
exactly. Okay. Well, I'll tell you what. I'll give you a couple of examples. First of all, the EPA. I mentioned that I was doing that with the Office of Research and Development. And the focal point in this case was environmental research and the federal government over the next 5 years. So it was specifically looking not just at research, but environmental research that was either supported or funded by the federal government. The first Royal Dutch Shell example that I gave you from the 70s, the focal point there was about how safe, or let's put it this way, was about how accurate the assumption was that oil coming out of the Middle East, which is where Royal Dutch Shell was getting most of their oil at that point, would remain plentiful and therefore would remain cheap. So they were really testing a series of assumptions about that particular market base. And in terms of the 1980s, they were looking at a specific question about, does it make sense for us to build this natural gas platform in the North Sea? So their focal point was relations between the Soviet Union and the West.
So the assumptions in those earlier scenarios were also the focal points.
Somewhat. Think of it this way. We can create a focal point that will test particular assumptions. So the assumptions get examined. They don't have to be the focal point or what you're focusing on, but they can be.
Okay, so if the focal points that you had put up for consideration included, say, water use and availability.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And it's testing different So the scenarios would then consider ways different inputs would affect how available water is going to be. Please
Sure.
carry that through.
Sure, absolutely. In fact, I'll tell you what. Let's play with this right now using water use and availability. Okay. So let's suppose we choose that as what we want to focus on. Okay. And we decide we're going to look over the next 5 years. So we start out by then saying, so what are the trends right now in terms of water use and availability? Well, let's see, decreasing rainfall, greater droughts, falling water tables, more conflict over water rights. So those are trends that are happening right now. What are some unknowns that we have about water in this area? Okay. And what other variables are there out there? So we would identify what those are. And we might discover that the two most, let's say the two themes that emerge in terms of water use would be that there are a wider use of diverse demands on water. Let's say 20 years ago, the primary water demands were going to come from agriculture and ranchers, and let's say agriculture and ranchers. And now there are much more domestic population because of population growth. As land gets leased, much more demand for water use for, let's say, mining or mineral exploitation of some sort, and much more demands for water use just in terms of basic conservation issues to help maintain a particular biosphere. So you have more demands, more players on water use. So that might be one of our trends, okay, or one of the key issues that's coming up. And then a second piece might simply be that there's simply less water availability. Now, there may be less availability because there's some pollution or some degradation of the water quality, or there may be less water availability because of excessive use and less rainfall, okay? So based on those two areas, we can create scenarios that look at different issues around water use. So if you have a lot more people using it, but you have less rainfall, what would that mean? Or you have a lot more people using it, but you have a higher level of pollution, what would that mean? And how do existing funding levels and existing strategies prepare for that? Okay. What assumptions are going on that may be incorrect or we may need to test? So that's how this might play out. Now, I've just explained that at a very high level, shooting from the hip, with no expertise on that particular topic at all, okay? If we were to go out and research this, we may discover that there are far more important trends and themes than the ones that I just mentioned. Does that clarify anything for you, Linda, or is there something you want to follow up with on that, or something that I may have said that made things more confusing?
No, I think the way you talked through it was helpful to see how you would use the ranking, the priorities.
Yep, absolutely. And, you know, what may happen is we might end up in a situation where once everyone has prioritized these, we don't end up with a topic that everyone picked as their number one, but we may end up with a topic that ended up as everyone's number two. Because what happens is, Linda, let's suppose you picked water use and availability number one, but let's suppose Jeremy picked climate as number one, and let's suppose that Aaron picked human dimensions. Let's say conservation planning is number one. And so everyone's got a different priority, top priority. But everyone agreed that wildfire was no lower than number two or number three. So that may end up being our focal point, just to give you a hypothetical. Any other questions, either about focal points or any of this stuff that we've talked about? And by the way, Linda, that was a good question about this. And as we go through the process, Levi and we'll keep all of you updated, and we'll give you more details about where we are and how we got there. And as you start to see the scenarios, as you start to see this process play out, it'll all become even clearer for you. So any other questions, any other comments?
Yeah, this is Jeremy. I'm just curious, what's the final product going to look like? How will it be organized?
Well, the final product will consist of at least 3 and usually 4 scenarios. Usually they get written as short stories, like think of one single-spaced page. But sometimes, depending upon resources and depending upon the nature of the story, they're delivered orally. I have had clients where it's been set up as a mock news report. Someone actually creates a video. And you've got Channel 4 News getting ready to wrap up, and they go, wait a second. We've just heard from so-and-so. There's a wildfire breaking out just outside of Lakeview. Let's go to Eli in the field at Lakeview. And they cut to someone with a handheld camera talking about how this wildfire's been going on, and there have been 200 days of consecutive wildfire breaking out within the Great Basin area, and there's no relief and whatever. Okay, and so it can look like a number of different things, but the deliverable, the formal deliverable, is 3 to 4 scenarios that are then presented in a workshop where there's a facilitated conversation. And then in that workshop, there are a series of questions that we look at. So for instance, these topics, like what are we unprepared for? What was a surprise? What assumptions are we making? What assumptions do we need to test? Where are our data gaps? What are our blind spots? Okay, that have strategic implications for everyone. So that means that collectively, okay, for this particular project, as well as individually for all of you for your respective bureaus or agencies, you're going to have opportunities to say, so what is it about our plans that would work well in this world, and what part of our plans would be a very poor fit if this scenario played out. So you end up getting a lot of strategic insight, a lot of action items. In some cases, the action items may be, we need to go out and research these 5 topics, or we need to go out and challenge or confirm these 4 assumptions that we're making.
So will there be potential to have map products and specific scenarios designed around actual places on the landscape, or will it be more broadly kind of looking at the region and the trends of the region? For example, for the water issue, you have Lake Abert, right, kind of in the heart of where we're looking at, that is kind of the focus of a lot of water issues. And I'm just curious,
Yep.
Will there be kind of specific products around potentially Lake Abert if water was chosen, or a similar example for one of the different focal points?
Sure. I'll tell you what, it really depends on the scenario, because you can write a scenario that involves a specific issue or a specific area. And to Levi's point about some of these topics will intermingle, let's suppose that we had a scenario where the focus point had to deal with government regulation of land and water use policies, or just government regulation around conservation issues. We could have a scenario where the federal government and the state governments really step back and don't provide a lot of regulation. And so that lake that you just talked about, there ends up being a series of people competing for use of that lake and abusing it, because no one owns the lake, but everyone wants to take advantage from it. From a systems perspective, it would be what people talk about in terms of the tragedy of the commons, where there's space that everyone uses, but no one owns it, so no one's responsible for caring for it. So some of the scenarios could end up getting very, very specific and very, very detailed.
Great, thanks.
Okay. Any other questions? Any other comments? Okay, Levi, is there anything that you want to say to wrap stuff up?
I don't think so, no. I think you've done a great job, and there was some good questions in there. So,
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thanks to all of you, because like I said earlier, I know you're all busy, particularly this time of year, and I know this took up a chunk of your time. But I hope you found it useful and insightful, and Levi and I will have a lot more details for you. Look for that email in the next couple days, okay?
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Very much. Yeah.
Gave us some good things to think about. Appreciate it.
Good stuff. Thank you.
Yeah.
Take care.
Bye-bye. And
Thank
happy
you.
holidays, everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah, you too.